Yeah, so I'm going to talk about communal living in the 21st century, and talking about this topic is weird for me because on the one hand, it's a way I've been living for 5 years. On the other hand, it's something I'm studying, and so I often have to do like this awkward, like wear one hat and the other hat thing, and it's a bit of a shuffle. But anyway, let's get on with it. So the reason I'm framing the talk as being communal living in the 21st century is because I think that the 21st century is exposing us to a set of new challenges and tribulations that I'll get into in a bit more depth in a second. But in a way, I think what's so hard about dealing with our problems right now is that in order to solve those problems, it means actually questioning the very ways in which we live in really dramatic ways. And so this leads me to my interest in communal living because in a lot of ways, the communes that I'm familiar with, the ones that I'm studying, are reimagining everyday life in the 21st century in really profound ways, and in ways that I think could have serious consequences for the future. So in thinking about the way we live, I've trained as sort of an architectural historian, so I always try to look at, before approaching any kind of a design problem, and I think the communal thing is something of a design problem, I try to look at the history of how the sort of status quo came to be in the first place. And so for me, I turned to the built environment of the progressive era to try to get some understanding of how we came to be where we are now. Because in a lot of ways, the crises that we're in are the failures of the institutions that were solidified in that era. So at the end of the late 19th century in America, in Britain too, but especially in America, cities were a disaster. There basically were huge amounts of people moving into cities from what were before that quite tightly tightly knitted Puritan communities and colonial towns. Suddenly, huge amounts of people are moving into cities with no rhyme or reason. Like the cities were not being designed to accommodate all these people. There was not infrastructure to support all these people. There also were not laws or social institutions that would offer you guidance for living in a new anonymous urban life. And in the face of this, and you can see sort of images of the type of chaos that was there. I mean, I think this image says a lot, the dead horse next to the playing children. So in the face of this, you had reformers, social reformers. Social reformers were like the people who would give TED Talks at that time. They were sort of the thought leaders of their time, who wrote things and pontificated in public, tried to organize committees and groups, and eventually they came to run governments. First to form certain types of governments like municipal governments, and then to run them. So reformers were generally upper middle class people who had an interest in preserving society because they had a lot of commercial capital invested in society. And they looked at the cities and they saw a lot of chaos and a lot of catastrophe, and for them, there were a number of things that had to be done. On the one hand, you needed to find a way to make it so that business could just keep running. The cities were so chaotic that it was hard to even remain in business. The working class was falling apart. Your workforce was therefore falling apart. It was hard to circulate goods in the cities because there were literally dead horses in the streets and so forth. So on the one hand, they needed to sort of deal with the physical problem that was the metropolis. On the other hand, they're really concerned with sort of normative institutions and social life, so dealing with social problems. And so one of their solutions for dealing with these things, one of many, was organizing the middle class into nuclear families on a mass scale. So people had been living in nuclear families prior to this, but especially in the 1920s, the matter of getting people to live in nuclear families as like the standard was put on sort of like a high burner. So through an organization called the Better Homes in America campaign, reformers were seeking to domesticate the middle class, and on the surface, through this organization, what they were doing was promoting home ownership. But actually, when you get into looking at their literature and their discussions, those are discussions that the reformers were having at the time, and their underlying mission, they really wanted to shape American citizens in order to make them into productive workers, proper housewives, and obedient citizens. This is sort of evidenced by Herbert Hoover, who was an American president in the 1920s, who was one of the founders of this organization, who says that by advancing home ownership and interest in the home, Better Homes in America is working for better citizenship. It is promoting character training in the home and is helping to build a healthy environment from which may come forth sturdy workers with honorable determination to achieve something worthwhile in life and to do a worthy share of the world's work. So quite explicitly stating these sort of social engineering goals that the reformers had. So one of the ways in which they achieved this was through a gendered difference in the way that you might relate to the house. And they did this at school. So they had to train children in these norms. It wasn't something that was just natural or something they possessed already. They had to be trained in this in the home or in the school. So girls would go to homemaking cottages and boys would go to houses. Girls would be taught to do domestic labor and chores, and boys would be taught to assess the quality of houses and to build houses. So from the female perspective, the home is this sort of soft space of informal economic activity, and for boys, according to these norms, the house was meant to be a commodity sitting in the marketplace. So the house becomes this central way in which we gender children in America. So there are a lot of perks to suburban life, and I don't want to just paint it as all bad. Certainly, people wouldn't do it if there weren't perks, but it also had its downsides. And so this specific way of occupying space and conducting life, that is in privately owned houses, it witnessed a massive proliferation of gender roles, something that I'm really interested in. So a set of normative expectations around behavior and social behavior. Individual households also were meant to operate as sort of units of consumption, and as such there were tremendous environmental consequences, so they were extremely inefficient, and actually by design they were relied on to revive the economy, especially after the Great Depression, because they were so inefficient. It took so much resource consumption to live that way. And then on a social level, you have a tremendous amount of atomization, and with that comes a lot of social isolation and exclusion. So these are some of the problems I think that this old way of life had. And crucially, and this for me has become a really central point in my research, the nuclear family was imagined as a passive rather than an active unit. So that the family was imagined to embody norms that were designed by other people than those people who were in the family. It was not meant to be an agent in any way. Part of that is a dependence on markets, a heavy dependence on markets, but also the dependence that markets have on unwaged and unremunerated domestic labor. And I'd be happy to get into sort of the economics of this in the Q&A if you're interested in it, but I just figured I'd throw this slide in there without getting too heavily into economic theory. So to return back to the 21st century, now we've talked a bit about this sort of reformist origin of suburban life, I want to make two main points about where we are today. So for one thing, many of our institutions, that is institutions that were laid down by these reformers, are entering a crisis. So today, at least in the United States, we have rising costs of living, stagnant wages, a deteriorated social safety net and social welfare programs. Our economy is underperforming for most people. There's pervasive loneliness and social isolation. We're also facing environmental catastrophe and rising inequality and pervasive poverty. And a lot of people, half of Americans in fact, report that if they were to encounter an emergency, they would not even be able to scrape together $400 to deal with that emergency. So you see that people do not have a lot of support. For a lot of people do not have a lot of support. And at the same time, alongside all these things, the government often imagines that people are part of these families and therefore have some kind of support, but actually people are not entering into nuclear families as much as they were in the past, and the figure is slowly declining. So the family is not even there to support many people. On the other hand, I want to make the point that our lives continue to be programmed by this old vision of what the good life is supposed to be and what it's supposed to look like. So we continue to be sort of attached to this wasteful, passive, and increasingly impossible mode of life. And those two things coming together, I think, spell a quite devastating crisis for a lot of people. So this evokes for me a book a 2010 book by Douglas Rushkoff called Program or Be Programmed. So Rushkoff, he's a media theorist. He's really interested in sort of social media networks and the ways in which, while they're meant to empower us and make us more social, in many cases also program our behaviors. So he thinks that these media platforms are actually shaping our social behaviors and manipulating us. And that's a really interesting point on its own, but I think what a takeaway I had from the book was just the way in which there's been an analog version of this through the built environment. And I hope that I was touching on this a bit in the slides from the progressive era, the ways in which people were designing a way of life to be imposed on many, many other people. Even if they played a part in choosing it, it was still, they didn't take part in the design process. So one of the things that really interests me about communal living is that it starts to play a programming function. Rather than just being programmed, it actually takes an active role in trying to shape new ideals for the good life and new models of political agency. Two categories that I want to look at, so like those animations. So these are some of the sort of subcategories I want to touch on now. So first, I want to talk about the ways in which collective life is providing for a lot of people a higher material standard of living through collaborative consumption. So collaborative consumption is when you and other people pool your resources in order to increase your collective buying power. And so we're seeing this happen in communes in a number of ways. So first of all, people are benefiting from economies of scale. So when you buy in bulk or buy large amounts of something, you can pay less price per unit. So this is especially true for food, but it's also true for things like toilet paper and paper towels and all these other things that end up actually costing you a lot of money if you're buying them individually. Also, you benefit from variety of food. So this is another thing that I think is rising the quality of life. Sharing amenities, so people can have amenities they wouldn't be able to afford on their own, like cars and hot tubs and bowling alleys and crazy things like that you just could never have on your own, but when you live with 20 people, it suddenly becomes feasible. Access to bigger, nicer homes. So the price you pay per square foot of real estate in most places is higher as your place gets smaller. So this is why so many real estate interests are interested in micro units rather than big places that people share, FYI. And also, there's a pooling of resources. So I might possess, I don't know, a certain number of books and maybe some electronics, and you might possess a different set of books and some different electronics, and we can just use each other's stuff. So this is another way in which people are materially benefiting from living collectively. On the question of sharing, I just want to say, I want to address the different levels at which people are sharing. So there are different scales at which people are organizing collectively. So there are different sort of housing associations. There are global federations of communal houses that actually organize in such a way that people living in one can go visit the other houses because they're sort of associated in a network. So this is how I'm able to go to Berlin, because we have a commune in San Francisco that's associated with a place in Berlin, which is associated with a place in Amsterdam. And so you can sort of hop from place to place. These communities generally share things like software platforms, global strategies, and also narratives and structures of meaning. So they share political discourses a lot of the time. Stepping down a rung is the local federation. So especially in San Francisco, you're seeing lots of communal houses basically organizing into these local associations where people are engaging in various kinds of sharing, but also support for each other. So there are emotional support systems put in place, like sort of parallels to the legal system, sort of therapeutic mutual aid strategies and so forth. Engaging in legal advocacy, so trying to change the laws to be more favorable to collective life, and sharing big things like vehicles and so forth. Down a rung more is the household level, which is sort of the commune, and so you see things like tools being shared, appliances being shared, food, cooking, pets, other things like this. And then to go down another rung, there are often subsets of people who share in more intense ways within communes. So it might be a couple, it might be a corridor of people, it might be people who share a room or share a couple of rooms in an area of the house, or just friendships within the house. So you might have even more intimate levels of sharing. But I just wanted to point that there are all these sort of different levels of sharing and organization occurring. So these are some photos from San Francisco. So this is the Red Victorian. This is a wood shop that we have in the Red Victorian, a thing that is full of expensive tools that you couldn't afford on your own, but living collectively, you can have access to a thing like this. Just some images of bulk buying of food at the Embassy, which is the sister house of the Red Victorian in San Francisco. Meals and eating together is another big thing. So someone will usually be in charge of cooking each night, and what that means is you get a home-cooked meal all the time, but you only have to cook once a month. If you have a 30-person commune, or once every 2 weeks you have a 15-person commune. So it works out to be pretty efficient. more food stuff. And I'm trying to evoke a sense of abundance, because in a lot of ways that's really what you get when people are living collectively, is this feeling that scarcity is not necessarily a thing that is imposed on you. To give a sense of the spatial qualities, these are images from the Embassy, one of our collective houses. It's this really opulent Edwardian mansion in San Francisco, with a bowling alley in the basement and stuff. And it actually becomes relatively affordable because people are sharing it. So yeah, just to say that these spaces are quite nice, and they offer a lot. More just images of collective life. So now I want to speak about some of the social perks of living collectively. So people living in these houses are benefiting from all sorts of support from each other. So networks of support, whether that's emotional, financial, or otherwise. Access to care and comfort. So being in close proximity to people actually has like health benefits. And yeah, I think a lot of people are advantaged by that. You also have access to high amounts of social and sexual opportunity in a lot of cases, and I think most people find those things advantageous. There's professional opportunity that's available to people living in these spaces, because everyone has broader social networks, and I've seen all sorts of people basically benefit in their careers by being in proximity to other people who are thinking about working on stuff. And then the broad reaching social network is another big perk of living together. So here's some images of sort of collective life. I should also say it's really fun. It's just extremely fun. A lot of people feel like it's one of the most exciting things they could possibly do, because you get to throw weird beach parties indoors, or use your space to, I don't know, co-work, or have art shows, or host big events. And so some of these images are from that. And finally, it's extremely efficient and effective. So when you share your domestic labor, you end up doing a lot less in terms of time, committing time. And you're also a lot more organized in terms of what you do, so things don't just like go without being taken care of. Like everything is basically handled all the time. And that's, I think, a big deal. So here's the Red Victorian. This is our sort of chore chart, so looking at the way that we sort of map responsibilities to people, and you can sign up for any of these sort of stewardship roles, and then here are the sort of chores, and we basically stay on top of making sure that all these things get done. So now I want to shift over to models of political agency. So if all that was about sort of higher quality of life, now I want to talk about sort of some of the political significance of this. So one of the things that happens when you're living in these spaces is because it's efficient, because it's effective, because because it basically makes a surplus of space and time and money, you can choose to do something with that surplus of space and time and money. And so there's a lot of different ways in which we're using those, and I think those will get expressed in the latter categories here. So another just point I want to make is that I think we are environmentally much more efficient than a bunch of people living in suburban houses or even apartments, because well, a lot of the big things we share. So we share cars, we share a lot of other resources like big resources, durable goods. We also bulk buy food, and we probably waste a lot less food than individual households. I don't have metrics on this, but some people have approached me to actually study this at points, so I'm hoping we can get metrics on this. They also, and this really interests me because I'm really interested in the personal being a realm of politics, they start to challenge and replace norms. So if you're living collectively, gender stops making as much sense, and I think gender, especially gender norms and gender roles, and automatically assigned roles that, according to gender, start to mean less. There are a lot of different ways in which people are challenging norms and structures. So there's something about living in like a social milieu wherein if you're all sort of on board with, like, I don't know, dressing differently or speaking differently or behaving differently or in some way, it feels easier when you have an enclave in which to do that, rather than just doing that on your own as an individual in a world that doesn't understand what you're doing. So I think that can sort of fast track a lot of sort of like social innovation, which is pretty fascinating. And then I guess this question about property and propriety and privacy, these are all sort of being thrown into question. And so people are starting to look at their homes as being these like quasi-public spaces, and navigating what it means to not completely be isolated from the world when you're at home, and exploring the sort of politics of this stuff. I think it's a really interesting set of questions. So I think the most interesting thing for me is the way in which the communal organizations are forming alternative institutions. So institutions that can actually replace the state and the market in some cases. So some examples of this are an alternative justice system that has been set up in San Francisco. So trying to address harms and harmful behaviors. Emotional and psychological support. So we have things like sort of group therapy where everyone's sort of helping each other, kind of like an AA meeting, but without it being about alcohol and without there being a therapist. It's just like a space for people to support each other, which turns out to be really powerful. Also exploring intellectual ideas. So we have salons and lectures, and we can just run these in our houses because we have these really giant spaces and we have these huge networks of people to invite to talks and stuff. And yeah, we just have things actually quite similar to this happening on a weekly basis there. And then we also have all sorts of sort of art and art shows and music and so forth happening in the collective spaces. So so these things starting to be things that you do in your home or in your friends' homes. So we often attend events in each other's communes rather than going to like stores or concerts or whatever. These things are happening in our spaces. So that starts to be interesting to me. Just to give some examples of these para-institutional forces, I just wanted to like show a list of some of the projects that are happening in some of the San Francisco communes. So we have the Bay Area co-parenting networks of people trying to figure out how to raise children together in maybe non-coupled ways. Experimental design, salons and lecture series, live concerts, so classical music coming in, life drawing, sort of like innovative urban events, the alternative justice movement I was mentioning, Hate Street Commons, which is one of those neighborhood-wide associations of communal living spaces that are trying to change policies. Recovery Squad, which is aimed at people dealing with substance abuse issues, not just in our houses, but also on the peripheries of our houses or in our wider communities, trying to show up for those people and get them the help they need. A post-gender men's group, which is an interesting discursive space and an emotional support space. And then support circles, the other emotional support space I was mentioning. So there's a wide variety of things that are all happening, and it's sort of made possible by the fact that these people are living together. Finally, I just want to quickly touch on political involvement. So we've been using our spaces to discuss specifically political issues, and to have these be these discursive spaces, I think is really important. They serve as something of a hub for discussion, not just for us, but for the people who sort of orbit our community. So each of these communal houses generally has hundreds of people who come to it on a regular basis or visit for one reason or another. We're starting to endorse candidates and policies, advocate policies, which I think is a whole new set of steps that we're taking as political agents. So pushing to change laws and so forth. And then also creating alternative economies. So by having this like dense network of closely associated people, you can start to opt out of the market a bit more, maybe work a bit less, and then dedicate that time to things that you find that are more meaningful and important to you than showing up to a 9 to 5. And I think that's not to be sniffed at. So I don't want to suggest that communal living is for everyone, and I definitely don't think it can solve all of our problems. Yet, today's communes, I hope, are challenging the sort of current crisis of imagination that imagines that there's no alternatives to the crisis-ridden status quo. So while most of us, I think, take our environment and our preferences and our social dynamics for granted, I think the parallel institutionalism of communal living is offering something different. And through experimentation, collaborative building, and vast quantities of critical thinking, all of which are happening in the communal world, people are actively designing alternative versions of everyday life in turbulent and uncertain times. And I think this is really important. So thank you.